3 hours after my husband threw me out into the freezing night, the phone in his kitchen rang, and it wasn't me on the other end. It was a detective. She told him his wife was lying in a hospital bed with a gash on her head, and that a gray SUV had been seen speeding away from where she fell. Elijah would walk into that hospital room expecting to find a liar. Instead, he'd find a truth he never let himself see coming. But before any of that, there was a locked door, a porch light going dark, and a man I'd loved for 18 years choosing his son's word over mine. I was 50 years old, standing on my own front porch in a thin wool sweater watching my husband turn the deadbolt from the inside. The snow came in sideways under the porch light, stinging my cheeks, while Caleb stood behind him with the calm, satisfied posture of a man who'd just won a war I didn't know I was fighting. "Go, Ava," Elijah said through the storm door, not even opening it all the way. "I don't want to see you until the money's back." "You actually believe I stole from you?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I believe my son." 5 words. 18 years, and it came down to 5 words. It was the last night of January, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. I had on a sweater, slacks, and the flats I wore around the house, nothing more. My phone, my wallet, my coat, even my blood pressure medication were still inside, sitting exactly where I'd left them that morning. Caleb had gathered my things from around the house earlier that evening and locked them in our bedroom, telling his father I was getting ready to run. That a woman who wasn't planning to disappear wouldn't need her passport within reach. Elijah believed him. He gave me 10 minutes to leave and wouldn't let me back in for my phone, certain I'd use those minutes to erase evidence of something I hadn't done. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I told Elijah as calmly as I could manage, with my teeth starting to chatter, that the bank was already investigating irregularities on the account that I was the one who'd reported them. Caleb cut in before I finished the sentence. "Don't let her stall, Dad. She's been doing this for weeks." I looked at my husband's face in the porch light and understood in that instant that he had already reached his verdict. He hadn't asked me a single fair question. He'd simply handed down a sentence and expected me to serve it. I stepped back off the porch before he could call the police and claim I was the one causing a disturbance. The door locked behind me with a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. Standing there in the cold, I thought about all the years that had led to this moment. I thought about the winter I helped Elijah dig himself out of debt after his first divorce, back when he had nothing but a leased apartment and a 14-year-old son who barely spoke to him. I thought about sitting in an emergency room at 2 a.m. when Caleb broke his leg at 16, holding his hand while he cried, long before either of them called me family in any way that counted. I thought about the semester of college tuition I quietly covered, so Caleb wouldn't have to drop out, and the jewelry, my mother's jewelry, that I sold without telling Elijah, so the dealership wouldn't go under during the recession. None of it mattered now. A folder of doctored paperwork and a few well-placed sentences from Caleb had erased 18 years in a single evening. I started walking toward the gas station roughly a mile down the road, the only place I knew would still be lit at that hour. The wind cut through my sweater like it wasn't there. My flats filled with snow within the first few hundred yards, and I could feel my feet losing sensation, that dull ache turning into something worse. I kept my arms wrapped around myself and my head down, counting mailboxes to keep my mind from spiraling. Somewhere past the 3rd or 4th house, I heard an engine accelerate behind me. Headlights swept across the road, too bright, too fast for a quiet residential street at that hour. I turned instinctively, some old instinct from my fraud investigation days, telling me to get a look at the vehicle, and that's when my foot caught a patch of black ice. I went down hard, my temple striking the curb. The last thing I saw before the world tilted and went dark at the edges was a gray SUV idling a short distance away, its taillights glowing red against the falling snow. Something about the shape of it, the dent along the rear panel, was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop even as consciousness slipped from me. It looked exactly like Caleb's car. I don't know how long I lay there in the snow. The last thing I remember is a woman's voice, sharp with panic, shouting for someone to call 911. 3 hours later, the phone rang in my husband's kitchen. But the police weren't calling to ask if he wanted to come bring his wife home. They were calling because they needed him to come identify what was left of the story he thought he knew. To understand how I ended up alone on that road, you have to go back 6 weeks to the day Caleb showed up on our doorstep with 2 suitcases and a story about a tech company that had laid off half its staff. He said his girlfriend had left him. He said he just needed a few months to get back on his feet. I looked at Elijah's face when he asked if his son could stay with us, and I said yes because I loved my husband and because I remembered what it felt like to watch someone you love struggle without anyone catching them. I didn't know yet that I was the one who'd be caught. Within the first 2 weeks, I noticed things. Caleb took phone calls in the backyard, pacing his voice dropping whenever I came near a window. He asked more than once in that offhand way people use when they're testing the water what the house might be worth if we ever sold it. I found him in Elijah's office more than once, thumbing through folders that had nothing to do with him. He suggested gently at first, then less gently, that his father should add his name to the deed, just in case anything happened. He told Elijah when he thought I wasn't listening that I'd gotten controlling over the years, that I liked keeping my husband dependent on me. I spent 11 years investigating insurance fraud before I became a risk consultant, and old instincts don't fade. I started noticing the kind of details that used to build a case file. A bank email showing a login from an unfamiliar device. A request to transfer $85,000 into an account tied to a shell company I'd never heard of. A photocopy of Elijah's signature sitting in the printer tray, practiced several times over like homework. An audio editing app installed on Caleb's laptop that had no business being there. Payments flowing out to a sports betting site from an account registered under Elijah's dealership. I didn't confront him. Confrontation, in my experience, only teaches a liar to hide better. Instead, I quietly reported the irregularities to the bank's fraud division. I photographed the device history before it could be wiped. I called Detective Naomi Price, someone I'd worked alongside years earlier, and asked her off the record what I should be documenting. I brought copies of everything to Linda Chen, my attorney of almost 2 decades, and asked her to keep the investigation quiet so Caleb wouldn't have a chance to destroy what I'd found. What I hadn't accounted for was how quickly he'd notice me watching. Caleb realized I was building something against him, and rather than run, he decided to get ahead of it. He built his own story, and he built it well. He created a fake email made to look like it came from me and sent it to a local real estate broker inquiring about a quick sale. He printed up a draft contract with my name typed at the bottom. He took a screenshot of the pending transfer request and cropped it so it looked like a completed transaction rather than a request still frozen in the bank's verification queue. He took my father-in-law's watch out of the box in my dresser drawer, a watch I'd sent out for repair 3 weeks earlier with a receipt sitting in a drawer in my office to prove it, and left the empty case behind for Elijah to find. The worst of it was the recording. I'd had a phone call with Linda about setting up a clear medical power of attorney in case Elijah ever had another dizzy spell like the one that sent him to urgent care that spring. What I'd actually said was, if Elijah becomes unable to make decisions for himself because of a stroke, we need a clear medical power of attorney in place. Caleb ran it through some kind of editing software and cut it down to 11 words. Elijah will no longer have the right to decide. We need power of attorney. Stripped of context, it sounded like a woman plotting to take control of her husband's life. Caleb took that lie to his father in pieces, never all at once, always at moments when Elijah was tired or vulnerable. I don't want to break up your marriage, Dad, he'd say, soft and reluctant like a son forced into an unwanted role. But maybe she's been planning to leave for a while now. He knew exactly which wound to press. Elijah's first wife had drained a joint account and vanished with another man years before I ever entered the picture, and Elijah had never fully healed from missing the signs. Caleb used that old scar like a lever. "You didn't see it coming last time," he told his father one night when I was upstairs and couldn't hear the exact words, only the tone. "I just don't want it to happen again." The night it all came to a head, Caleb laid the folder out on our kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting a closing argument. Elijah confronted me, but he wouldn't let me see the full contents, only the pieces Caleb wanted him to see. I tried to explain that I was the one who'd reported the bank activity in the first place. Caleb didn't miss a beat. Of course she'd say that. The person who gets caught always claims to be the one who found it. Elijah asked about the sale contract. I told him truthfully that the house couldn't be sold without my signature on it. Caleb turned my own words into a weapon. "Hear that, Dad? She just said the house is hers. That was the moment Elijah learned for the first time in our marriage that his name had never been on the deed. His face changed. Not anger, exactly, something closer to humiliation, the particular sting of learning something in front of your own child that you should have known for years. I tried to explain the timeline that I'd bought the house before we married, that it had nothing to do with trust or lack of it. He wasn't hearing me anymore. He was hearing 18 years rearranged into a story where he was the fool. What stays with me most, thinking back on that kitchen table, isn't Elijah's face. It's Caleb's in the half-second before his father turned to look at him for confirmation. Not anger. Fear. I understood it clearly only after I was already lying in the snow. Caleb hadn't simply wanted me out of the house that night. He needed me away from my phone and my computer before whatever he had planned could unfold without interference. The woman who found me was named Mary Ann Foster, a 62-year-old retired nurse driving home from her sister's house, when her headlights caught something dark against the white shoulder of the road. She told me later that she almost mistook me for a fallen branch, that it was only the shape of an arm against the snow that made her slow down. She pulled over. She called 911 before she even got out of the car. She kept an emergency blanket in her trunk, the kind she'd carried for 30 years out of old nursing habit, and she wrapped it around me while she waited for the ambulance, talking to me the whole time, even though I couldn't answer her. She noticed a gray SUV pulling away from the area, its taillights disappearing around the corner without stopping, and some instinct told her to memorize part of the license plate before it vanished. She wrote it on her palm in pen because she didn't trust herself to remember it otherwise. At St. Catherine Medical Center, Dr. Samuel Reed diagnosed me with mild to moderate hypothermia, a mild concussion, a laceration at my temple that needed stitches, and an irregular heartbeat brought on by the cold and the stress on my system. He wanted me monitored for several hours before he'd consider releasing me. I remember surfacing slowly, the fluorescent lights too bright, the beeping of a monitor keeping time with my pulse, and the first coherent thought I had was to ask what time it was. The second was to ask someone to call Detective Naomi Price. Naomi arrived within the hour. She recognized me immediately. We'd worked the same insurance fraud case years earlier, back when I still carried a badge instead of a consulting fee. She didn't hug me or fuss over me. She pulled a chair beside the bed and asked me to tell her everything in order, starting with the moment Elijah locked the door. I told her. Elijah had thrown me out. Caleb had taken my phone. The vehicle at the scene might have been Caleb's. Caleb knew I'd been quietly working with the bank's fraud division, which meant he had a reason to want me isolated that night. Naomi didn't leap to conclusions. She told me plainly that it was entirely possible the SUV near the accident was a coincidence, that grief and fear have a way of making people see intention where there's only bad luck. But the fact that Caleb's vehicle had been in the vicinity and that whoever was driving hadn't stopped for a woman lying unconscious in the snow was something that needed to be looked at regardless of intention. The evidence started coming in fast after that. Mary Ann provided the partial plate number from memory. Footage from the gas station down the road showed a gray SUV matching Caleb's passing by within minutes of my leaving the house. Automated license plate readers confirmed the vehicle had circled back through the neighborhood before leaving again. The bank called to report that someone had just attempted to log into the flagged account and cancel the fraud investigation altogether. The login traced to a device registered to Caleb. With the risk that evidence could be deleted at any moment, officers moved quickly to secure an emergency warrant for his devices. Naomi called Elijah herself. I could only hear her side of it from the hospital bed, but it was short, deliberate. Mr. Morgan, this is Detective Naomi Price. Your wife is at St. Catherine Medical Center. I heard the tinny panic through the phone even from a few feet away. The hospital, what happened? She was found unconscious on the side of the road, suffering from hypothermia. You need to come now. He asked apparently whether I was pressing charges against him. Naomi's response was flat. You should be worried about whether she makes it through the night safely. Caleb tried to keep him from leaving. I only learned the details afterward, but Elijah told me Caleb argued that I was staging the whole thing, that I'd deliberately put myself in danger to make him feel guilty, that the police might be trying to bait him into incriminating himself, and he ought to call a lawyer before going anywhere. Elijah said something in Caleb's tone that night finally struck him as wrong, too calculated, too rehearsed for a son worried about his father. "How do you even know your stepmother was in an accident?" Elijah asked him. Caleb hesitated, then claimed he'd overheard it during the phone call, but Naomi had never used the word accident. Elijah arrived at the hospital not long after. As he approached my room, he saw 2 officers standing outside a representative from the bank's fraud department, and Linda Chen, my attorney, already seated near the nurse's station with a folder in her lap. On a small table near the doorway sat his father's watch, sealed inside a clear evidence bag. He walked in slowly. He looked at me, the white bandage at my temple, my skin still pale from the cold, the IV taped to the back of my hand, and something in his face cracked open. Then, Naomi stepped forward and placed a printed still frame from the gas station camera on the table in front of him. Elijah looked down at the image, at the driver behind the wheel of the gray SUV. His face went the color of the snow outside the window. "No," he said so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "This can't be happening." Elijah stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like a full minute before he made himself walk toward the bed. I watched him take inventory of me, the way you'd survey damage after a storm. The bandage at my temple, the pallor in my skin, the IV line taped to the back of my hand, the plastic hospital bag on the chair holding my soaked, ruined sweater. He noticed my feet last, the faint frost nip along my toes, and something in his expression buckled when he understood what that meant. He had sent me out into a blizzard without a coat, without shoes fit for weather, without so much as my phone to call for help. "Ava," he said, "I didn't know." "You knew it was snowing," I said. I kept my voice even. There was no use raising it. Some truths land harder when they're spoken quietly. Naomi stepped closer and held up the printed still frame again, walking Elijah through what had actually showed Caleb's SUV near the spot where I'd fallen, time-stamped only minutes after I'd left the house. She was careful professional, unwilling to overstate what the photo could and couldn't prove. It didn't show intent. It didn't prove he'd meant to run me off the road. But it proved he'd been there. It proved he'd seen me. It proved he hadn't stopped, hadn't called for help, and had gone home afterward and told his father he'd never left the living room. Elijah shook his head almost reflexively. Caleb was home with me. Naomi laid out the plate reader data beside the photograph, the timestamps lining up like a ledger that left no room for argument. I watched my husband's certainty crack in real time, watched him arrive slowly and against everything he wanted to believe at the same conclusion he'd spoken in the doorway. "No," he said again. "This can't be happening." Then Linda took her turn. She explained in the calm, unhurried tone she used with juries that I'd sent Elijah's father's watch out for repair 3 weeks prior. She had the receipt. The jewelry shop had security footage of the drop-off time-stamped and dated with my signature on the intake form. Caleb, she explained, had gone to the shop afterward and picked it up under false pretenses, claiming to be retrieving it on his father's behalf. He'd left the empty box in my drawer for someone to find at exactly the right moment. Officers had since located the watch itself hidden in a compartment beneath the driver's seat of Caleb's car. I watched something shift behind Elijah's eyes. The folder Caleb built wasn't evidence. It was a stage set. The bank's fraud representative spoke next, laying out the transaction Caleb had used as his centerpiece. I hadn't withdrawn $85,000. I'd reported the suspicious request myself days before Elijah ever saw a printed screenshot. The transfer had originated from Elijah's old tablet, a device he rarely used anymore. The verification code meant to confirm the transaction had been rerouted to a prepaid phone number linked to Caleb. The receiving account belonged to an LLC Caleb had registered using an old friend's name to keep his own off the paperwork. Elijah couldn't look at me directly anymore. He kept his eyes on the folder Linda had brought, as if staring hard enough might rearrange the facts back into the shape he'd believed that morning. He tried weakly to explain that Caleb's evidence had seemed convincing at the time. He said he'd only meant for me to be gone one night. He said he'd planned to come find me himself in the morning. I asked him the only question that mattered. "You turned off the porch light while I was still standing on it. Where exactly did you think I was supposed to go?" He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters more than the drama of the reveal itself. I didn't forgive him in that hospital room. I didn't feel a wave of relief wash the anger away just because the truth had finally surfaced. Caleb built the lie, yes. But it was Elijah's hand on the deadbolt. It was Elijah who chose not to ask me a single question before passing judgment. I said as much to him plainly without raising my voice. Caleb built the lie, but you're the one who opened the door and pushed me out into it. He had no response to that either. Some silences say more than any apology could. Naomi's phone rang before the moment could stretch any further. She stepped a few feet away to take the call, her expression sharpening as she listened. When she came back, she told us the search team had gone through Caleb's room at the house. What they found went beyond anything any of us had expected. A copy of the deed to our house, my name circled in pen like a problem to be solved. Sheets of paper covered in Elijah's signature, practiced over and over until it was nearly convincing. A drafted contract transferring ownership of the house into Caleb's name. An unsent email to a lending company still sitting in the drafts folder. And beneath all of it, a life insurance policy newly issued $750,000 written on Elijah's life. The sole beneficiary was Caleb. Elijah's signature was on that policy too. It was forged just like everything else. Naomi laid it out for us methodically, the way she must have laid out 100 cases before mine, careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence actually supported. Caleb hadn't set out simply to steal $85,000. That figure was only the opening move. The plan, once you saw all its pieces lined up together, had 4 stages. First, convince Elijah that I was the one betraying him. Second, get me out of the house and cut off my access to my phone and computer before I could interfere. Third, persuade Elijah to sign over financial power of attorney framed as a way to protect himself from a wife who could no longer be trusted. Fourth, use that authority to borrow heavily against the house and the dealership. What Caleb hadn't accounted for was the ground he thought he was standing on. The house was never Elijah's to mortgage. I'd bought it in 2002, years before Elijah and I ever met, and my name alone remained on the deed. The equity Elijah had contributed over the years existed under a separate financial agreement Linda had drawn up early in our marriage, protecting both of us. The dealership carried debt I'd conditionally guaranteed, and Linda already had documents prepared to revoke that guarantee the moment fraud was confirmed. Caleb had built an elaborate scheme on top of a foundation that had never belonged to him. Naomi played the full, unedited recording of my call with Linda, the one Caleb had cut down to 11 damning words. In the original, I was talking about setting up a clear medical power of attorney after Elijah's dizzy spell that spring. I want Elijah to keep making his own decisions for as long as possible, my recorded voice said. The power of attorney should only take effect if he loses the capacity to think clearly for himself. Caleb had sliced off the first half entirely, leaving only a sentence that sounded like a woman scheming to strip her husband of his rights. Hearing the full version played back in my own voice in that sterile hospital room was its own kind of vindication. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The financial picture that emerged from the search was staggering. Caleb owed more than $140,000 spread across 3 private lenders who didn't extend the kind of patience banks did. He'd used dealership paperwork as collateral without Elijah's knowledge. One lender had given him a week to produce $60,000 or face consequences he clearly didn't want to describe to police. He believed with the kind of desperate logic debt produces that mortgaging our house would solve everything. There was resentment tangled up in the desperation too. 3 months earlier, I'd refused to hand him cash to cover a gambling debt. I'd told him calmly that I'd pay for treatment for a real program, but I wouldn't fund the habit itself. I'll pay for you to get help, I'd said. I won't pay for you to keep betting. He'd told his father afterward that I hated him, that I wanted him gone from the family entirely. It wasn't true, but it was useful, and Caleb had never been shy about using whatever was useful. Sitting in that hospital bed, I found myself walking Elijah back through years of warning signs he'd chosen to explain away. Caleb taking his father's credit card without asking, lying about finishing his degree, borrowing money from his aunt and then denying it to her face. A car accident while driving under the influence that Elijah quietly paid to settle rather than let his son face any real consequence. You didn't protect Caleb, I told him. You taught him that every consequence could be paid off by his father. I watched that land harder than anything else I'd said all night. harder than the forged signatures, harder than the insurance policy. A man can absorb evidence of a crime more easily than he can absorb the idea that he built the person capable of committing it. Linda brought out the deed to settle the last piece of confusion. I'd purchased the house in 2002. Elijah moved in 2007. We married in 2008. His name was never added, not out of secrecy, but because he was still working through financial obligations from his first divorce when we married, and the timing never seemed to matter enough to revisit. I'd once suggested drawing up a lifetime right of residency for him, ensuring he'd never lose his home no matter what happened between us. The paperwork sat unsigned for years because he kept putting it off. I hadn't used the house as leverage or as a weapon. I'd used it quietly as the one piece of ground beneath me that no one could take. I made a few decisions that night, and I said them plainly without softening them for anyone's comfort. Elijah wouldn't return home while the investigation was active. He could retrieve personal items only with an officer present. Caleb was barred from any access to the property. I would begin the process of revoking my guarantee on the dealership's fraud-tainted debts. And the marriage itself, that decision would not be made tonight under fluorescent lights, with stitches still fresh in my scalp. Elijah asked me quietly not to end things. "You ended my sense of safety the moment you locked that door," I told him. "Everything after that is mine to decide in my own time." Naomi stepped back into the room before he could respond, her expression tighter than I'd seen it all night. Caleb, she said, had gone back to the house. Doorbell camera footage showed him in the garage pouring gasoline, attempting to burn a box of documents in a metal bin. Officers were already on their way. Elijah's face drained of whatever color the hospital lights had left in it. His son wasn't simply trying to erase evidence anymore. He was prepared to burn down the house itself in the same breath he'd once claimed he was only trying to protect. Officers reached the house before the fire in the garage could spread past the metal bin Caleb had been using. What they found there closed the last gaps in the case. Gasoline, torn copies of bank statements, a laptop with its screen smashed in as though he'd tried to destroy it with his bare hands, a prepaid phone, the forged contract transferring ownership of the house, threatening text messages from at least one of his lenders, the kind that made it clear his week to produce $60,000 had already run out. Caleb was arrested that night. The charges that followed were serious, though careful identity fraud forgery, unauthorized access to financial accounts, evidence tampering, and destruction of property by fire. Naomi was honest with us about the accident on the road. The footage showed Caleb slowing near where I'd fallen and driving on which supported a charge of leaving the scene, but there wasn't enough to prove he'd deliberately tried to hurt me. I appreciated that honesty more than I can say. It would have been easy for the story to tip into something cleaner and more satisfying Caleb as an outright attempted killer, but that wasn't what the evidence showed, and I didn't want a version of the truth stretched past what actually happened. I was released from the hospital 2 days later, still weak, still moving carefully around the stitches at my temple. Elijah and I both attended Caleb's initial hearing, sitting several rows apart in a courtroom that smelled like old wood polish and nerves. Caleb looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the composure he always wore like a second skin. He spoke to his father first, his voice pitched low, urgent. "I did all of this to protect you from her." Elijah's answer came out flat. "By letting her freeze to death in the snow." Caleb denied it immediately, insisting he'd only followed me to make sure I left the neighborhood, nothing more. Naomi had already shown us the footage of his car slowing as it passed me on the road and then continuing on without stopping. He didn't have an answer for that timestamp, and for a moment his composure slipped enough that I saw briefly the frightened man underneath the performance. He turned to me next, some of the old coldness returning to his face. "That house was supposed to belong to this family. I was your family for 18 years, I told him. You only remembered that word when you wanted something from it." Elijah faced his own reckoning in that courtroom hallway afterward. Caleb, given one last chance before being led away, begged his father to cover his bail the way he'd covered every consequence before. It was in its own way the final test of everything I'd said to Elijah in that hospital room. For the first time in 18 years, he said, "No, you need to face what you did," he told his son. Caleb's composure cracked entirely then, and he turned the blame outward, accusing me of taking his father from him. Elijah's response surprised me more than anything else that day. "No," he said, "you're the one who showed me the man I'd let myself become." It wasn't forgiveness, not for me, not yet. But it was the first real sign of a man beginning to take responsibility for the shape of his own choices, rather than handing the bill to someone else the way he always had. Linda spent the following weeks untangling the financial wreckage. Caleb had no legal claim to the house, that much had never been in question, but it was formally permanently confirmed. His name was removed as a beneficiary from every account and trust connected to Elijah. I bore no responsibility for the debts he'd accumulated using the dealership's name. The business itself would need restructuring, but Linda had shielded most of it from the forged paperwork before real damage was done. My own assets, the house included, remained entirely separate and untouched. The larger question, what happened to my marriage, took longer to answer. Elijah asked to come home to start over to try to rebuild what 18 years had apparently not been enough to protect. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, a few days later, I handed him an envelope. Inside was a legal separation agreement, a temporary arrangement for dividing our belongings, a list of what he could take from the house, and tucked behind the legal paperwork information for a 6-month lease on a small apartment across town, the first month already paid, so he wouldn't find himself without a roof over his head in the middle of winter, regardless of what he'd done to me. He looked at the folder for a long moment before he spoke. "After everything I did, you're still helping me." "I don't want you dying out in the cold," I told him. "That's the difference between us." I meant it as a simple fact, not a performance of virtue. Some people confuse mercy with weakness. I've never believed the two were the same thing. He looked down at the separation papers again, and I watched him search for something to say that might change the outcome. "Is there any chance for us?" he finally asked. "Not for the marriage we used to have," I told him. I didn't say more than that. I hadn't decided yet whether anything else might exist on the other side of what we'd both survived, and I wasn't going to manufacture false hope just to soften the moment for him. Some doors close permanently. Others simply need time before you know which kind you're standing in front of. 6 months passed before the last pieces of that winter finally settled into place. Caleb accepted a plea deal with the prosecutor rather than risk trial. He was sentenced to a fixed prison term, along with financial probation and a restitution order that would follow him for years. As part of his sentencing, he entered a mandatory gambling addiction treatment program inside the facility. The incident on the road never became a criminal charge in itself. There wasn't enough evidence to prove intent to harm, but his decision to leave me unconscious in the snow rather than stop was formally noted in the sentencing record, a permanent mark on the story of who he'd chosen to be that night. Elijah sold his stake in the dealership to satisfy the legitimate debts Caleb's scheme had left behind, and he began living more simply than he had in years. He started attending a support group for parents of adult children struggling with addiction, something I hadn't expected from him, but was quietly glad to hear about. Our divorce was finalized in early summer. I made my own decision about the house not long after. I didn't hand it over to charity in some grand gesture the way stories like this sometimes end. I'm not interested in performing generosity I don't fully feel. Instead, I sold it. I couldn't picture myself continuing to live in the place where my own husband had locked me outside in a blizzard, no matter how many good years had happened there before that night. With part of the proceeds, I bought a smaller house near Lake Erie, close enough to hear the water some mornings when the wind was right. With another part, I started a legal aid fund for women over 45 facing financial abuse within their marriages. Women who often discover the way I did that, the people who are supposed to protect them can just as easily become the ones who need protecting from. I named the fund after my mother, not after myself. She was the one who taught me long before any of this happened that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be true. Elijah came to see me at the new house once near the end of that summer to return an old set of keys that no longer opened anything of mine. He stood on the porch for a moment before I invited him in, and I noticed he didn't try to push past that invisible line the way he once might have. I thought locking you out that night was protecting our family, he said. Family doesn't need to be protected from the truth. I told him. He apologized for more than just believing Caleb. He apologized for not asking me a single question before making up his mind, for not trusting 18 years of history over a folder full of lies, for choosing his own comfort that night instead of my safety, for using a snowstorm as a punishment. I accepted the apology. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. Accepting an apology isn't the same as inviting someone back into your life. I told him as much. Forgiveness doesn't come with a key, I said. He nodded like he understood, and then he left. I watched him walk back to his car from the window, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not triumph, not even relief exactly. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after a long time of not having any. That evening, snow began to fall again, light and unhurried, settling over the new walkway the way it had settled over the old one 6 months earlier. But this time was different, and I noticed every part of the difference. I had a warm coat on. My phone was in my pocket, fully charged mine, to use however I chose. My keys were in my hand, not locked away in someone else's decision. I was the one who would decide tonight and every night after whether that door stayed open or closed. Marianne, the woman who found me in the snow that night and never once asked for anything in return, came by for dinner with a few of my friends. I opened the door and let them in out of the cold, the sound of their laughter filling a house that had never once belonged to anyone but me. 6 months ago, a door closed behind me on the coldest night of the winter. I remember thinking in that moment that the sound of that lock turning was the sound of my life falling apart. I was wrong. It was the sound of a prison opening. Elijah believed his son's lies and put me out of my own home. It took the police a hospital bed and a stack of forged documents to show him the truth. But the truth that mattered most to me was never written on any of that paperwork. I don't need a man who only believes me once the evidence has been laid out in front of him. I need someone who believed in who I was long before any evidence became necessary. Outside, the snow kept falling over the new path to my door. I rested my hand against the frame, listened to my friends laughing behind me, and locked it, not to keep anyone out but to protect the peace that finally lived inside. This time the key stayed in my hand. I'd love to know what you think Ava's next chapter looks like. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so hit subscribe and don't miss a single moment. Let's keep this journey going together.